What would you do if your mother-in-law renamed your baby right in front of you? If she stood beside the priest, smiling like it was her gift to the world, while you clutched your child and felt your voice fall away? What would you do if she looked you in the eye and said, "This is how family legacies live on," and she meant hers, not yours? I did not scream, I did not weep. I held my son close and memorized the weight of that moment. The air smelled like roses and candle wax, and the choir sang softly behind us. No one knew a theft had just taken place. That was the day she took my silence as surrender. She was wrong. That was the day I began taking everything back. Before all of it, I lived in a quiet rhythm. I had traded lecture halls for lullabies, syllabi for sleep schedules. My world was small but deeply mine. After 2 miscarriages and a pregnancy that left me more prayer than person, holding my son felt like holding proof that I could still win a battle without losing myself entirely. I named him Elias. I whispered it into the folds of his blanket the day we brought him home. The name came to me in a dream during the 3rd trimester, after a night of aching and worry. It was the only name that ever felt right. It wasn't up for debate, not between Nathan and me, not with anyone. Evelyn, my mother-in-law, was polished. That's the word she liked best for herself. She wore the same pearl studs every day and called it elegance. Her compliments always had a shadow in them. She called my small home quaint, my writing clever, my career break understandable for now. She never raised her voice, but she never let you forget she had one. She was the kind of woman who arranged family photos 2 months in advance, who corrected you with a smile that made it hard to protest. She never directly said she disapproved of me, but her silence after anything I chose spoke louder than a shout would have. When I was on bed rest, she visited often, uninvited, and rearranged our kitchen because it was more functional her way. Nathan always said she meant well, that she was proud in her own way. He'd grown up in her world. He didn't recognize control because he had been raised to mistake it for care. I never blamed him for that, but I stopped explaining it after a while. I just stored the moments. When we began planning the baptism, Evelyn offered the church, the priest, the guest list. She said tradition was important, that it gave a child roots. Nathan agreed. I didn't fight it. I chose the christening gown. I wrote Elias's name by hand on the small invitations. It felt like a truce. But truce, I learned, is only peace in the eyes of someone who's planning their next move. That morning, she brought lilies for the altar and a gold-embossed Bible for her grandson. She kissed my cheek and told me I looked rested. Her eyes held nothing, no tension, no warning. I mistook her calm for kindness. She mistook mine for weakness. The church smelled of wood polish and incense. The morning sun filtered through stained glass, painting the pews in amber and blue. I held Elias against my chest, his breath soft, his fingers curled around the edge of my scarf. Nathan stood beside me, proud and distracted, waving quietly to his cousins across the aisle. Evelyn arrived like she always did, confident, perfectly composed, holding a thin envelope and wearing a dress a shade too formal for the occasion. She greeted the priest like an old friend. They spoke in low tones near the altar. I remember her placing that envelope in his hands, gently, as if handing him something sacred. When the moment came, I stepped forward, cradling Elias as the priest raised his hand and spoke. "We welcome into Christ's light Thomas Edward Mercer." My heart stilled, my grip tightened, my mouth opened, but no words came. The name echoed off the stone walls like it had always belonged there. Thomas Edward, not Elias. It took everything in me not to look at Evelyn, but I saw her from the corner of my eye, smiling, serene, hands folded in front of her like she had just saved the family from a terrible mistake. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. I remember water on my son's forehead. I remember Nathan hesitating when repeating the vows, his eyes darting to mine. I said nothing. I didn't trust what my voice might do if I spoke. Outside, as the guests gathered for photos, Evelyn leaned in, brushed a hair from my face, and whispered, "It's tradition. His grandfather's name deserves to live on. You'll see it was the right choice." She had filed alternate naming paperwork at the registrar's office 2 days earlier. She had used an outdated power of attorney that Nathan had signed long before we were married, meant only for medical emergencies during his deployment years ago. Somehow, she had convinced the clerk to push the change through. On paper, our son had been renamed. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just smiled for the photos. Let Evelyn pose beside the child she believed she had claimed. I let her hold him for a moment too long, her hand patting his back like she had won something. When we returned home, I closed the nursery door behind me, rocked Elias to sleep, and stared out the window for hours. I had learned something that day. A woman like Evelyn doesn't need to raise her voice to steal something precious. She only needs access and an audience. And I had given her both. The days that followed moved in silence. Not the kind that lingers after a fight, but the kind that settles before a storm. I fed Elias. I folded laundry. I kept the house warm and the lights low. And in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn, I gathered every strand of what she had done. I started with the documents, the hospital forms, the birth certificate copy. I requested the paperwork Evelyn had filed. There it was in black and white, Thomas Edward Mercer, submitted by her. Backed by a notarized copy of that dusty old power of attorney Nathan barely remembered signing at 22. He said it had nothing to do with our child, that he hadn't even known she still had it. I didn't argue. I just asked him to sit with Elias while I met someone. Her name was Lily Quinn. We had taught at the same university before I left. She had gone on to practice family law. When I explained what had happened, she went quiet. Then she said calmly, "This is identity interference. We can undo it, but you'll need to be exact." So I became exact. I combed through Evelyn's texts, emails, and voice messages. I printed screenshots of every post she made about baby Thomas, every caption dripping in pride. I found an application for a family trust she had initiated in his new name, listing herself as trustee. I marked every discrepancy, every line she crossed, while smiling straight through it. I created a folder labeled Name Theft, another for witness statements, one just for social patterns. I even found a florist receipt. She had ordered a custom baptism wreath with the name Thomas printed in gold 3 days before the ceremony, before anyone else knew. She had planned it down to the candles. At home, I said little. Nathan sensed a shift, but he mistook it for exhaustion. Evelyn still visited, holding Elias like he was her second chance. I let her. She had no idea what I was building, piece by piece, behind the calm in my eyes. I began journaling again, not to vent, but to document. I logged the moments when Evelyn overstepped, the words she used, the way Nathan hesitated. I remembered how often she had referred to Elias as her son's son, never our child. Every phrase felt like a thread in the same tapestry. And slowly, I began pulling those threads. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam a single door. But I was learning the architecture of her power, and I had started sketching the blueprint for her exit. I waited until the leaves began to change before I made my first move. There was something fitting about autumn taking the place of summer. Everything looked golden from a distance, even as it prepared to fall apart. Lily filed the petition to legally reinstate Elias's original name. We attached the evidence, page after page, showing how Evelyn had acted without consent, manipulated outdated legal forms, and exploited a technicality. The request went through under emergency privacy provisions. It would take time, but the foundation was sound. I did not tell Nathan right away. I needed to finish building without interruption. without interference. I had learned something about silence. When used wisely, it can protect you from sabotage. Next, I met with a child psychologist who specialized in identity development. She wrote a formal statement in support of the name Restoration, citing emotional harm and long-term psychological confusion if the name forced upon Elias was allowed to stand. That report went into the file, attached with expert weight. Then came the trust account. I contacted the bank directly. They had no idea the primary parents had not authorized the fund. Lily sent a cease and desist, and within 48 hours, Evelyn's access to anything financial tied to my son was revoked. I cleaned out the nursery, removed the monogram blankets Evelyn had gifted, replaced the framed photos with ones I had taken myself, quiet, natural moments. I hung a new mobile above Elias's crib, one I had made from folded pages of the book where I first saw his name. Then I wrote the letter. It was not angry, it was clear. I told Nathan what had happened in full: the forged name, the paperwork, the posts, the trust. I told him what I had done to correct it, and I ended with a question, not an ultimatum. Who are you prepared to protect, your son or your mother? I left the letter on his side of the bed, next to a copy of the court petition. I knew Evelyn would try to make her next move soon. I had kept just enough distance to let her believe she was still winning, but her web was fraying, and my hands were no longer idle. Finally, I sent invitations to 5 people, a small gathering, a riverside chapel. No photographers, no pearls, no grandmothers. Just truth, spoken aloud. Just Elias, held close. Just his name, returned. The second baptism would not be for show, it would be for healing. And it would be mine to give. I invited them to dinner, not to a restaurant, but to our home. I made roasted chicken with rosemary. Set the table with the wedding china Evelyn had insisted we register for. The house smelled like thyme and something warm. Nathan lit the candles. He didn't ask why I had requested this evening. Not yet. Evelyn arrived in her usual way, a bottle of wine in hand, a too tight smile. She kissed Elias's head and complimented my earrings. She didn't know this was the last time she'd be welcomed through my door. We sat, we passed plates, we spoke of nothing, until dessert was cleared and I brought out the album. It looked like any family photo, book leather bound, simple, curated. I placed it between them, turned to the first page, and spoke. This is the story of the name you stole. Each page was evidence, the falsified form, the notarization Evelyn had orchestrated, the date stamps, the florist receipt, her emails, the trust paperwork, screenshots of her social posts, copies of the baptismal invitation I had created with Elias's name printed clearly across the front. Everything was ordered, labeled, undeniable. Nathan looked from the pages to his mother, back to me. His face was pale. She laughed, low, tight, said it was exaggerated, that I was blowing things out of proportion, that I was ungrateful for everything she had done to preserve our family's name. I slid the court papers across the table, the name Restoration filing, the formal cease and desist from the bank, the restraining order request waiting for the judge's signature. You manipulated a legal loophole to rename my son without consent. You violated parental boundaries. You interfered with his financial identity, and you did it under the illusion of love. Evelyn's smile cracked then, just slightly. Her hand clenched the edge of her napkin. Nathan spoke, slowly, haltingly. You changed his name without telling me? She tried to spin it, that he had signed the papers, that it was only to honor tradition, that I was being dramatic, vindictive. I stood, walked to the sideboard, and retrieved the letter I had written him. I handed it to Nathan. He read it without speaking. When he looked up, his eyes were glassed over. She's right. You didn't just cross a line. You buried it. Evelyn pushed back from the table, wounded pride painted across her face. "You're choosing her over your own mother?" "Number," he said quietly. "I'm choosing my son. For the first time in this house, I'm making that choice." She left without touching her wine, without saying goodbye. The door closed with a soft click. No shouting, no chaos. Only consequence. Later that night, Nathan sat beside me while I rocked Elias to sleep. "Thank you," he whispered. I didn't answer. I simply looked down at our son, whose name now lived again, untainted. Justice doesn't always arrive with fire. Sometimes it wears silence like armor. The silence that followed Evelyn's departure was not empty. It was clean. The kind of silence that clears a room of smoke and leaves only air behind. The court approved the name restoration within 3 weeks. Officially, legally, undeniably, our son was Elias Mercer once more. The certificate arrived in a white envelope, simple and unceremonious. I opened it alone at the kitchen counter and exhaled for the first time in months. Evelyn's attempts to contest the order fell apart quickly. Her history of manipulation, backed by the documentation Lily and I had assembled, left little room for sympathy. The judge issued a temporary restraining order, citing psychological coercion and emotional interference in the child's welfare. It was later extended to a full year. She appealed, of course, but by then her name was already fading from our daily rhythm. She no longer appeared at our doorstep. No more surprise visits. No more lace-trimmed notes. No more gifts with quiet obligations hidden inside them. Word spread in her circle, though not all the details, just enough for people to distance themselves. A few family friends stopped responding to her invitations. Her social calendar thinned. She stopped posting photos of Elias. The Mercer matriarch, once so present in every moment, had become conspicuously absent. Nathan changed too, slowly but noticeably. He started noticing things he had once dismissed, the subtle corrections, the power games dressed as concern. He apologized not with grand speeches, but with action. He handled the legal follow-ups. He sat in on therapy sessions with me. And when Elias was sick one night, he held him until morning without once asking what his mother might have done differently. We were rebuilding, but this time with clarity. I returned to teaching part-time. Only 1 class a semester, but it gave me breath. Something that was mine again, separate from the damage, separate from motherhood. Elias thrived, his days quiet and uninterrupted. His name became a song in our home, repeated in stories, in lullabies, in soft calls from room to room. Sometimes Nathan asked if I ever missed the old peace we used to fake with Evelyn. I told him no. Because peace built on silence is not peace, it's permission. And I had revoked it. It was early spring when I returned to the Riverside Chapel. The trees were just beginning to bloom again, their branches soft with green. The same breeze that had carried through Elias's second baptism now stirred the edges of his blanket as he slept against my chest. There was no ceremony this time, no guests, no priest, just me, my son, and a name that belonged to him. I sat alone on the stone bench behind the chapel, the river moving steadily beside us. The water was higher now, fed by thaw and time. It whispered as it passed, a sound that seemed to echo the months we had lived since she left. I reached into my coat and pulled out the old baptismal program, the one with the stolen name printed on the front in raised gold letters. I had kept it, not out of sentiment, but as a record. A reminder of how quietly people will rewrite your life if you let them. Elias stirred, one hand tightening in the fabric of my shirt. I looked down at him, his face calm, his breath steady. He would never remember any of this, and that, more than anything, was the victory. His first memories would be clean. His name, intact. His world, quiet. I rose and walked to the offering bowl at the chapel's side wall. It was old, carved from dark stone, filled with folded notes and coins left behind by other hands, other hopes. I placed the program gently into the bowl. No ceremony, no need for fire or spectacle, just release. Then I turned back toward the river and stood for a while longer. I no longer thought of Evelyn when I looked at my son. I no longer scanned every sound for the echo of her footsteps. She had been removed not just from our lives, but from the space she once held in my mind. And as I walked away from the chapel, I did not look back. What she tried to take had been returned. What she tried to control had slipped through her fingers. What she tried to rename, I had reclaimed. Elias murmured in his sleep, and I kissed the top of his head. His name is Elias. It always was. It always will be. And no one will ever take that from him again.